Today's video is about finding common denominators. Please remember, if you need to pause to catch up at any time, you can do that. So we know that denominators are the bottom part of a fraction. And when we're talking about common denominators, we're talking about making those two numbers the same. So when do we use common denominators? Well, we use them all the time. There are two main times that we really use them. One of them is when we're comparing fractions. Once you have the same denominator in two fractions, you know that you're comparing the same size piece. So you're able to look at just the numerator and see which one is greater or smaller. The other time that we use common denominators is when we are adding and subtracting fractions. Again, once your denominators are the same, you're working with the same unit fraction, which means you can combine those together because they're the same size. So we're going to end up finding common denominators for these two examples in the boxes below. But I first want to talk about the different ways that you can find them. So let's look at the bottom of the note page. The first question asks, what always works? So what can you always do to find a common denominator? The one thing you can always do is multiply the denominators together. So let's say, for example, I'm looking at 2/5 and 4/6. One way you can always find a common denominator is to take these two denominators, 5 and 6, and actually just multiply them together. So when you write these equivalent fractions, you would change 2/5 to something over 30 and 4/6 to something over 30, because 5 times 6 equals 30. That would be the easiest way to always find a common denominator. Now, another way to find a common denominator is to look for the lowest common denominator. And we call that the LCD. That is the lowest common denominator. And what that is the smallest number that goes into, that both of the denominators go into, The lowest common denominator is always going to be the same as or bigger than the denominators that you already have. Let's say we're looking at the two fractions 1/4 and 5/6. And I don't want to just do 4 times 6 is 24 and use that. I want to find the lowest common denominator. What you actually do is you write the factors of both of the denominators. So I have 4 as one denominator and 6 as the other. So I'm going to write my factors of 4, which is 4, 8, 12. And I'm actually going to stop there, because when I think about my factors of 6, I do 6, 12, and I see that both of these numbers go into 12. That is the smallest number that they both go into. So what I'm going to try and do then is write equivalent fractions that change 1/4 to something over 12 and 5/6 to something over 12, so that my common, or my denominators, are common. So let's go back and look at the examples, and we're going to solve these both ways. So I would like you to draw a line down the middle. And then we'll find common denominators for each. So let's start with 1/6 and 3/8. And let's start with the one that always works, which is to multiply the two denominators. So like I said, the strategy we're going to use is to multiply. So I look at 6 times 8, and I know that that is 48. So I'm going to change both of these fractions to something over 48. Now we're going to use a skill that we've used already, and that is to write equivalent fractions. So I have to take 1/6 and I have to change it so it's something over 48. So I have to multiply by 1/6 by something to make it 48. So 6 times what is 48? And we know that's 8. So I'm going to show times 8 over 8 in my work. I know that 6 times 8 is 48. So I have to do 1 times 8, which is 8. So 1/6 and 8/48 are equivalent fractions, but we're changing them to common denominators. When I look at 3/8 and I want to change it to something over 48, I think 8 times what is 48? I know that 8 times 6 is 48. So I'm going to multiply this fraction by 6 over 6. I know 8 times 6 is 48. So I have to do 3 times 6, which is 18. So I have 8/48 and 18/48. These are common denominators. They're the same number. And because of this, now I am able to compare them, because my unit fraction is 1/48. In the left fraction, I have 8 1/48 pieces. And in the right fraction, I have 18 1/48 pieces. So I know 8/48 will be less. The other thing I can do now is add them. I have 8 1/48 pieces and 18 1/48 pieces. So if I bring them together, I have 26 1/48 pieces. So because I have found a common denominator, now I am able to do those things with the problem. Okay, so I just did the strategy that always works. It gives you the 48, and that's great. But when we do end up adding and subtracting, you're going to end up with problems where the answer will need to be reduced. If you use the lowest common denominator, then less times do you have to reduce when you're done in the end. So let's look at 1/6 and 3/8 and think about how to do this using the lowest common denominator. So I'm going to write my two denominators, 6 and 8, and I'm going to start writing my factors. So 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18, 6 times 4 is 24. I'm going to stop there because I know 8 times 1 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16, and 8 times 3 is 24. So I see that 24 is the first number that they both go into. So 24 is the fraction denominator I'm going to want to use. Let's go back to the original problem then. I want to change 1/6 to something over 24. So what am I going to do to 1/6 to make it over 24? I know that 6 times 4 is 24, so I have to multiply the fraction by 4 over 4 to write that equivalent fraction. 6 times 4 is 24, and 1 times 4 is 4. So that fraction is done. Now I'm going to look at the 3/8. I have to make 8 24. I know 8 times 3 is 24, So I multiply that by 3 over 3. And I know 8 times 3 is 24. And then I look at my numerator and I see that 3 times 3 is 9. So I have 4 24ths and 9 24ths. I'm able to compare them and I'm able to add them. I cannot subtract them because it is 4 minus 9. All right. So let's try 3/4 and 7/8. Please draw that line down the middle. So we can do one with multiplying and one with the lowest common denominator. Okay, let's start with the way that always works. If we have 3/4 and 7/8, the way that always works is to multiply the two denominators together. So I take 4 times 8, which is 32. So I'm going to change these two fractions to have a denominator of 32. All right, let's start with 3/4. What do I multiply 4 by to make 32? Well, I know 4 times 8 is 32, so I have to take this entire fraction times 8 over 8, because to write an equivalent fraction, you have to multiply or divide by a value of 1. So 4 times 8 is 32, so 3 times 8 is 24. I look at 7/8. I need to figure out 8 times what is 32. I know 8 times 4 is 32, so I'm going to multiply this by 4 over 4. I know 8 times 4 is 32, and 7 times 4 is 28. So my new fractions with common denominators are 24 over 32 and 28 over 32. And the last thing we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take 3/4 and 7/8, and we are going to try to find the lowest common denominator. Now we're going to use 4 and 8. Now, one thing I didn't say before that I should have said is that you should always check when looking for a lowest common denominator. The first thing you should really always ask yourself is, does one denominator go into the other? So I'm looking at 4 and 8 here, and when I say, does 4 go evenly into 8, it actually does. So my lowest common denominator is going to be 8, and you'll see that when we write these here. 4 is my first factor. 8, 4 times 2 is 8. I mean, there it is already. And then 8 times 1 is 8. So we see already that our common denominator is 8. So I'm going to write my 8s down here. And then really, the only fraction we need to change is the fraction on the left, because of the one on the right already has an 8 in the denominator. So 4 times what is 8? We find that that's 2 over 2. 4 times 2 is 8. So 3 times 2 is 6. And then, like I said, the 7/8 already has an 8 in the denominator. So all you need to do is put the 7 on the top. You could, if you wanted, write times 1 over 1, because that's really what you're multiplying by. But you don't have to, because anything times 1 is the number itself. All right, so you're going to go practice this on your own now. Please refer back to the notes if you have any questions. Good luck.